right, so we are going to start off the second part of this module with a little activity. I want you to think of a conversation you have recently had with someone who came to you for advice or who you're working through a problem with. And I just want you to jot down the advice you gave them, how the conversation went, just briefly. You can pause here to do that. All right, so thanks for doing that. We're going to use that in just a little bit here. These are some issues that I came up with: parental involvement issues, creating culture in school staff, assessment and evaluation of students, implementation of new teaching strategies, attendance issues, inclusion of diverse populations. These are all things that, as leaders in schools, we are dealing with. And I'm sure you have some great ones down as well. So now we come to the importance of questioning. Obviously, we see the diversity of the issues that we are expected to deal with as leaders. These are multifaceted issues, and there's no way that as leaders we can solve every problem or know every solution. So we need to ask questions. We need to ask questions of the people around us to work towards collaboration in solving these problems. So Walsh and Sades explain, of course, that there's no ready-made, simple, fail-proof solutions. We have to formulate questions. That is our role as leaders. And even if there were, if we're not engaging others in reflection and dialogue, we're not helping the people that we are leading find personally meaningful changes. So they're not going to be as involved and they're not going to buy in. Third, they talk about how even if we could just mandate changes, we're not giving people the skills they need to adjust and change, which is, of course, something that's happening all the time in our global society. So the second we leave that school or that team, all of a sudden we've left with all the leadership, which is not something that we want. So the questions that we're going to be using today are some modified Socratic questions, which lead to really open-ended conversations. Adams explains that the intentional use of the Socratic method offers the opportunity not only for the consolidation of existing perceptions, but for critical consideration of assumptions about learning, teaching, and leading, for the transformation of frames of reference, and for decisions and actions emerging from new understandings. Open-ended and stimulating, Socratic questions are powerful prompts for considering our professional learning and practice. So this is what we want to do. We want to encourage this open-ended conversation so that we're working towards new ways of thinking. So I've taken these from Adams et al., and I'm just going to briefly go through the 6 different kind of sections of questions, and then you're going to do a bit of an activity with them. So clarification questions. So what do you mean by that? Or what is your main point? What is the definition of this that you're talking about? And so, of course, you can be using these for any situation. If you're talking about parental involvement with a teacher, if you're talking about an attendance issue with a student, if you're talking about behavior management strategies with a teacher, these are the questions that we're using. Origin or source questions. So where did you get this idea? Who do you know who does this very well? Can you think of some alternatives? Viewpoint questions. Is this idea or action consistent with your professional view? What concerns do you about this plan? How have other people responded? Reason and evidence questions. How do you know? How can you be sure? What led you to this conclusion? Implication and consideration questions. What would be the most desirable outcome? Can you see any difficulties arising from that course of action? Or questions about the question. Is your question clear? Why is this question important? Does this question trigger more than one answer for you? So here's what you're going to do. You're going to find a partner, and you're going to briefly describe the conversation that you reflected on and jotted down earlier at the beginning of this module. And what I'd like you to do is act out each other's situations. And you're going to use the Socratic questions outlined on the earlier slides to work through the problem. So no one's going to have the answer. You're going to discuss what the issue is that the person brought to you. And if you're not comfortable sharing the situation you jotted down, you can make one up. And your partner is going to use these Socratic questions to hopefully lead you to some sort of a collaborative solution to this problem. So you can pause this video here and go ahead and do that. All right, so I hope that that was a bit of a fun activity. Of course, we're talking about dialogue, so we have to do a little dialoguing ourselves. I want you to discuss as a group, how did it feel to use these questions? So as the person asking, how did it feel to be asked the questions? And I want you to, if you're comfortable, share some of the situations and discuss whether the outcome, the first outcome that happened when the situation actually happened, is different from the outcome that you've come to together. So you can go ahead and do that now. All right. Hopefully your discussion was very productive. I wish I was in person there so that I could hear what came out of that conversation, but unfortunately I'm not. So, as hopefully you've experienced, questions lead to inquiry, and they lead to sustained change. So first of all, inquiry. Engaging people throughout an organization or school community in meaningful conversations is the defining characteristic of learning organizations, learning communities, and professional learning communities. An inquiry-centered learner is encouraging questions, facilitating conversations, initiating investigations, welcoming multiple viewpoints, and the like. Inquiry-centered learners let others do a lot of the thinking and let them take credit for it. So hopefully you experienced that in your discussion. When you were working through it, hopefully more questions came up. Maybe the problem was defined and you've realized that this is something that really needs to be inquired into. Maybe you've gone back with an action plan instead of just a quick fix solution. And of course, second, sustained change. So too often change is introduced into schools without the opportunity for teachers to engage in deeper questioning and sustained learning about the what and the why of the change. Of course, this happens when changes just come top down and teachers aren't engaged or questioned, or their perspectives aren't considered. And what happens is meaningful reform is not happening. So we get superficial episodic reform and action without inquiry. And so what we see is initiative burnout, teachers not buying in, or meaningful change just not happening. This is what happens when we just go to the PD and we don't see any actual change in classrooms. So if we want teachers to be involved and we want them to be motivated to change and part of the process, then we need to guide them by asking the right questions. This leads to teachers actively taking a role of inquiry, of problem solving, and leads to change being meaningful and exciting and sustained in our classrooms. So I'm going to give you a little break here. When we come back, we're going to talk about giving feedback.